Kia ora, Anna. This is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Elisha Foon. Coming up.
He was pardoned and sent to prison rather than sentenced to death.
In Fiji, 3 high-profile prisoners convicted for their part in the 2000 military mutiny and coup have been granted presidential pardons. Also, the Secretary-General of the Pacific Islands Forum has labelled COP28 a disappointment as he reflects on a big year for the region. And later,
less than 2% of the psychologist profession is Pacific.
We hear from the newly appointed first Pacific Professor of Psychology at New Zealand's University of Otago. We begin the show with some tragic news and a sober reminder to everyone swimming in lagoons over the summer holidays. A 50-year-old New Zealand man has died in Rarotonga's lagoon at Avaavaroa Passage, which is a popular spot for swimming with turtles. Police spokesperson Trevor Pitt says police received a distress call Monday afternoon local time. Mr. Pitt says the man was pulled out of the water by a turtle tour operator, but was unresponsive. He says several people have drowned in Rarotonga's passages.
You'll find that at certain times of the day the current is the most strongest, and these rips can overwhelm swimmers quite easily. Even the most strongest swimmer won't be able to fight those currents.
We'll have more on this incident in our upcoming show. In Fiji, 3 high-profile prisoners convicted for their part in the 2000 military mutiny and coup have been granted presidential pardons. Fiji President Ratu Williame Katonavere granted clemency for Ngāi High Chief Ratu Inoke Takivakata, Timothy Silatolu and Josefa Nata at Government House in Suva on Tuesday. Ratu Inoke was convicted in 2011 for inciting mutiny at the Queen Elizabeth Barracks in 2000, while Mr. Silatolu and Mr. Nata were convicted of treason for their parts in the coup that followed. Kuroi Hawkins spoke with John Frankel, an expert on Melanesian politics at the Victoria University of Wellington, who was living in Fiji when the mutiny and coup broke out. He began by asking the professor what he thought of this week's presidential pardons.
Well, there's been talk about this of recent months, ever since the new Rambuka-led coalition government came into office. Talk about releasing George Speight, the coup leader from 2000, but also these 3 prominent figures from the 2000 coup. Ratu Inoke Takivakata is a Ngāi High Chief who was found guilty of inciting the mutiny on November the 2nd, 2000. This was a mutiny at the Queen Elizabeth Barracks. I lived very close to that. There was all hell broke loose on that day, and Bainimarama, the military commander, escaped across the cassava patch very famously. So that was a major disruption in Fiji. The other 2, Timothy Silatolu is an interesting fellow. He was actually a Fijian Association Party Member of Parliament. That was one of the parties that was actually in coalition with Mahendra Chaudhry, who was the Prime Minister that was ousted during that coup. But he went across and joined the insurrectionists and was sort of Speight's right-hand man. And Joe Nata also had a long history as a journalist. He was way back in the 80s behind I remember one article about Mara's millions claiming corruption under the government of Ratu Mara. The reason why those 2 got such long prison sentences was that they both pleaded not guilty, whereas a lot of the other ones, including Ilisari Lingere and various other key players in that coup, pleaded guilty, and they came out after only 1 or 2 years. So they have been in prison a hell of a long time, and I don't really think they pose any threat to the established order or to the military, and I suspect that these releases will have been canvassed with the military. One can't be certain, but that's likely.
Looking at this in context of Fiji's coups, where does 2000 sit, and are there other coup leaders? Are they all walking about and free? Are these the last people that are in jail for coups in Fiji?
I don't think there's anyone still in jail from the 87 coup, and no one went to prison for orchestrating the 2006 coup. although there was a court case against Bainimarama and the police chief, but that wasn't for orchestrating the coup. It was for interfering with the process of justice in relation to an investigation at the University of the South Pacific. The other key person, of course, that is in prison is George Speight himself, the coup leader from 2000, and he was given a life sentence. His situation is slightly different to the others because these three and other people are now receiving pardons from the Prerogative of Mercy Commission, but George Speight already received such a pardon because he was sentenced to death back in 2001, I think it was. I was in court on that day when the judge put the handkerchief on his head and pronounced the death sentence for George Speight, which was quite a kind of shocking kind of moment. And very shortly after that, he was pardoned and sent to prison rather than sentenced to death. So the argument about George Speight has been that, look, he's already had a pardon from the Prerogative of Mercy Commission, therefore he can't receive a second pardon. And the military have made clear that they're not keen on his release. And of course, for the military, George Speight is hugely symbolic. He's the military defined itself by its suppression of the 2000 coup and the mutiny that we already mentioned in November. So it's very important symbolically for the military to remember that experience.
The Secretary-General of the Pacific Islands Forum has labelled COP28 a disappointment. Lydia Lewis attended Henry Puna's final press conference for 2023.
Pacific leaders are in crisis mode, but the world doesn't seem to be listening to their climate crisis calls with both ears.
Overall, COP28 was a disappointment because of our prioritizing 1.5 degrees as our absolute priority with climate change. And of course, associated with that is the movement away from fossil fuel. Well, we all know what happened. We will never give up. We have to continue pushing for that 1.5.
Mr. Puna was pleased, though, to see young Pacific climate warriors in the mix.
Their voices must be brought to the center. Instead of in the side events, on the side, where only a handful of people get to hear of it. I have raised this issue with the climate change minister from Australia, Chris Bowen, in our bilateral at Dubai, to say to him that if we win the bid for COP31, that the ocean, along with the voice of our young people, must be center of that COP. The Minister Bowen has, agreed that is a good suggestion to make.
He says standout moments this year include the adoption and endorsement of the 2050 implementation plan.
That was a mammoth undertaking. I can tell you that, there was some skepticism by some of the crop agencies. That was an impossibility, but I was always determined with the Secretariat team that we will deliver. I mean, we have to deliver in accordance with our leader's directive.
And the Climate Mobility Framework.
This is the first regional climate mobility framework, and it's the first of its kind in the world. So in some ways, we are setting out new grounds in the international legal framework.
Henry Puna went on to say he's pleased to see the Forum family back together again. And he knows nobody is indispensable, saying he can only carry the baton so far.
I came into this role at a very difficult time, particularly when I was central to that difficulty. However, I'm pleased that looking back, we've succeeded in bringing the Forum family back together as one. And I'm also pleased that over the course of the last 2 years, especially in the last 12 months, we've been able to achieve so much.
He's expected to hand over the Secretary-General role to controversial former Nauru President Baron Wanga in May next year.
We will have a confirmation of the date for his assumption of office very soon. That's a matter that will be determined as to his contract and starting date between him and the Forum chair.
As for what Henry Puna plans on doing next...
Yeah, we can discard the last question.
Meanwhile, the incoming Forum Chair, Tonga Prime Minister Huakava Meiliku Siosisovaleni, will become Forum Chair at the opening ceremony of the next Forum Leaders Summit. This will be hosted by Tonga in August 2024.
The first Pacific Professor of Psychology at New Zealand's University of Otago hopes more Pasifika will follow in her footsteps. New Zealand-born Samoan, Dr. Siautu Alefao, has recently been appointed to the role, which combines modern psychology with traditional Pacific Island knowledge. Fino Fonua spoke with Dr. Alefao.
You're the first Pacifica Professor of Psychology to be appointed for Otago University. How does it feel, and could you describe your journey?
Yeah, thank you, Fino. I think firstly I feel really humbled by the appointment and really appreciative of my family, my parents. So I didn't discover psychology until probably in my second year. In my undergrad. So in my time, which was sort of the early 90s at university, especially as Pacific, psychology wasn't an area or discipline or subject that we even knew of. And when I came into university, I was introduced to psychology through education. So education had a paper on educational psychology, and that's when I discovered psychology and became interested. So I did my undergrad and my postgrad, my master's at Auckland. The pathway to being a practitioner or practicing psychologist is quite long, which in those days were a master's and then a postgraduate diploma of educational psychology. So I then did my postgrad diploma of educational psychology and internship at Massey University and my doctorate at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia.
And could you describe your field of study?
Yeah, right now, my area of speciality now is it's an intersection between Pacific Indigenous psychology and humanitarian and disaster response and resilience. So what that means is I'm really looking at the ways in which we as Pacific peoples of the diaspora, but also Indigenous to our Pacific nations and Moana, Te Moana Nui Kiwa or Moana is the ocean, how we have evolved over time and how we think and what our worldview is and what influences how we do what we do.
You mentioned the psychology around a humanitarian response to disasters. We've had quite a number of natural disasters in the Pacific. The volcanic eruption in Tonga, the cyclones in Vanuatu, all these different cyclones. Is your field related to that?
Yeah, very much so. The reality is, though, with things like disasters, the majority of our people actually are really resilient. So we tend to be able to move forward and move on quite well, but there is that small minority that, for lots of different reasons, who may have been dealing with quite traumatic events in their lives prior to a natural hazard, which then creates the disaster. It's the way we respond to these natural hazards that create disasters. And so in those instances, that's when, psychologists or counselling can have a real important role to play in supporting those that would take longer and that need continual support to their everyday mental well-being and their health.
Are there many Pacifica in the field of psychology? Is there a difference between when you started studying at university and now in terms of the Pacifica presence on university campuses?
Oh, yes, very much so. We were very rare when I came through. I think there was maybe only 3 of us at the time that were coming through, and now it's so heartening to see the numbers that are growing. And the reality is we need more Pacific peoples in psychology because it's a profession that is very much needed, but also it's a profession where we're still very much a minority. So I would say we're still probably less than 2% of the psychologist profession is Pacific.
Could you describe the moment you received that offer from Otago University?
I tell you, pure joy. I wasn't, to be honest, I wasn't expecting it. I didn't actually, I believe for myself, I didn't want, it wasn't like I set out to become an academic. I feel like, God had called me and appointed me into academia, and that's what I said. And so I think when I got the call and was offered the job, it was pure joy, a lot of tears, a lot of, I guess, initially screaming up and down, couldn't really, fathom it myself, but just, pure joy, to be honest.
That's Pacific Waves for today. To listen back, head over to rnzi.com/programs. We're also on Apple, Spotify and iHeartRadio podcasts. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, Tōwha Soifua.